So this week, Sprott has released a new junior uranium miners ETF, ticker symbol URNJ. No, I did not buy any, but today I want to have a broad overview of what the release of new ETFs can or cannot indicate, and how we just need to be, or how we need to wisen up and understand what could be at play. Not saying it is. And one of the reasons I'm not saying it is, as we'll get into, is because I added to my URNM. So if I indeed thought this was the top, I would not do that, or I'd be a fool to do that and to still do it. So I added to URNM and I added to BTU. Consol Energy released earnings on earlier this week, and the stock popped and then it dropped, and then I think it's down 9% from where it peaked. And ARLP and BTU, they all had negative reactions. BTU is going to be releasing earnings reports on the 12th, which is Tuesday. So we'll see how all that goes. And then that's really all I added to position wise. And rig is doing great. So as I noted, a new way for degenerate gamblers to play the uranium trade has come to the markets. Sprott Junior Uranium Miners ETF. My concern when I see new ETF listings is to ask myself, is this mid to top cycle behavior? Or because oftentimes it's definitely not a bottom cycle troughing behavior. So you're somewhere between the trough and the peak. And then the question is, where are we? And I think we have room to run, so I'm not concerned. But we're going to discuss today what might make me say something who is so foolish and doesn't understand the fundamentals and understand the macro backdrop and so on and so forth, as one might allege. So I want to tell you why I'm even bringing this up and why you need to be, aware of it. So we're going to run through some examples here. Silver peaked in April of 2011. This is a chart of silver. 1 year and 7 months later, SILJ, which is the Silver Junior Miners ETF, was released. As you can see, by the way, this is quite an interesting pattern, and the question is it getting ready to inflect or is it getting ready to drop? But you draw your trend lines wherever you want to. And, dollar index, blah, blah, blah. We're not getting into that here today, but I just wanted to note and compare silver peaking and then a silver ETF coming online. Then you have a slew of ETFs that followed suit in a similar fashion after the pot stock craze of the late 2010s. And here you have Aurora Cannabis and Canopy Growth Corp, just a couple of them. You choose whatever you want. And about 1 year and 5 months later, MSOS comes online. Coal. It peaked in July of 2008. And here we are with KOL, the Van X Vector Coal ETF, and its inception date was January 2008, a few short months before the peak of coal. And what we'll find out here is that ETFs emerge around a peak, and around in a day and week options trader laden market can be within quarters, within months. So it's all about having a proper understanding of what I mean by shortly. In December of 2020, coal shut its doors. Between the ESG pirates of the world and depressed prices, it wasn't worth it optically or financially. Optically, because this isn't just me trying to ESG criticized smuggled in my presentation, but ESG was cool, and things that weren't ESG, or I really should say bastardized, co-opted versions of ESG were the in thing, and that definitely made coal not one of the in things. And so that's the optical front. And then financially, I mean, why would you have it open if it wasn't really generating much money? So they closed it. In the time that coal, KOL, as I'm referring to it, existed, coal price, and by the way, in this sense, it actually kind of made sense for them to shut the doors. Coal prices went from $98 at the inception of the ETF, and then when they finally closed the doors, it was at $80. So it was a solid decade of negative returns on that front. And since then, since they closed coal ETF in December of 2020, coal has gone from that $80, and it peaked at beyond $200 or $400, but now it's around $368. It's less now from when I made this slide. Bitcoin. Wall Street was really on top of this one. They were not messing around. They wanted to make their money. So it actually preceded the top by a couple of weeks. As we noted with coal, it preceded the top by 6 or 7 months. Then on to uranium. And uranium, quote unquote, peaked, intermediary top, one might call it. Had to shake out the macro tourists and the paper tigers and paper hands. It peaked in April of 2022. And 10 months later, URNJ comes to exist. And by the way, there is a bias to this, because there has to be ETFs that were released in the, well, I hope so at least, because otherwise we're in trouble here if you're a uranium investor, because I personally do not know. I already had all of this in the back of my mind, so this was actually pretty easy to create. Maybe I've been blinded and overlooked or something else, or I dismissed it, but I don't, maybe in the comment sections you can let me know. It'd be nice to know if some ETFs, especially a set, if you can get a set of ETFs that were released, like maybe, I don't know, when Google and Microsoft and all of them started taking off, and after the '08, and then some tech ETFs came online, and the tech ETFs have done really well as Google and Microsoft and the constituents. It'd be nice to know, because I would prefer some counter examples and disconfirming information, because it's just good to know a good sample size of things. This is everything I just happen to know. And thus the cause for concern, or at least having a more acute awareness of what's going on and all the interchangeable components. Anyway, last uranium cycle. Uranium peaked at around $140 around June of 2007. And URA started trading 3 years and 5 months after the first top, and 3 months before the second big, quote-unquote, big move up. And in all fairness, that second big move was nothing at all like the first move in magnitude, but a $40 to $72 move in a very short time duration is a big move. Let's not forget that. Just because it's shadowed by a much larger move, because it's not just about the change, but the rate of change. And both of these moves had massive volatility and rate of change. Similarly to how the uranium, with the second smaller peak, the pot stocks had their first run up in September and October of 2018. If you notice a few slides ago, I indicated the top in 2019 because that was the last top. And so to adjust for this, that would put the release of the largest pot ETF 2 years afterwards. Now, not to get too disparaging towards the uranium crowd, but we have to think through the variables and the causes for concern. And so I'll save the most offensive for last. Price often follows narrative, but so does the creation of ETFs. They're one of many sentimental indicators as to what's going on in a broader niche domain. We're not reading tea leaves, people, okay? We're merely keeping our ear to the street and keeping an open mind and staying cognizant of all the variables in the complex nonlinear dynamic system. So, the ARC-X ETF, ARC Space Exploration and Innovation ETF, capitalized upon the penis rocket of Bezos and the pissing match between him and Elon. And there was a lot of hype, a lot of sentiment around that time. I think it was around the time that the UFO ETF came about as well. And here's the best part. Its inception date was 3/30, it was either 3/30 or 3/31 of 2021. But the chart only goes to April 1st. And if that's not an April Fool's joke, I don't know what is. Because that's pretty funny. An ironic juxtaposition. ETF creation is similar in spirit to the idea behind the economist's contrarian indicator. It speaks to the idea that a theme has become exhausted. It suggests that the story, whatever it may be, is priced in. It doesn't mean it's over, but that it very well might take a breather. That's the intermediary top that I was talking about in the uranium from it peaking 10 months ago. It speaks to the general consensus and dominating trends of the time. A couple of years ago, it was Cathie Wood's consortium of ETFs. Will the upcoming years have the likes but in new sectors and industry? It's a question worth asking. They don't often call bottoms and tops in the markets, but porn stars pumping ETFs and cryptocurrencies was a good one. It's worth remembering that stocks are treated as an expression of sentiment. So what happens when all the good news gets baked in? It means perfect isn't good enough, and that leaves nothing but disappointment and downside risk to come. Do the tourists need to leave with their paper hands, or are we getting ready to see the pump we've been waiting for and talking about when it comes to uranium? And as a final note, and yet again, please, in the comments section, if you do know of contraindicators to what I've demonstrated here, please do tell me what they are, because I really do want to know them. I'm not just saying that to passively and implicitly engage in interaction. I mean, I actually want to know. But on a final note, this is what I'm talking about with The Economist, making coal history. Let's not forget that this was released on December of 2020. That was the same month that the coal, KOL, ETF delisted. Now, this is selection bias because The Economist, I know for a fact that The Economist makes a lot of these and they don't come to fruition. So there is definitely cherry picking here, and that's the problem. You know, they call the bottoms of markets, you know, 5, let's just say 10% of the time, but what about the other 90% of the time? If this was a decision-making strategy and process for your investing, you'd go bankrupt. But it's still fun, and yet again, still an indicator. And it's not to go ignored. And especially when you compare it across other large publications and what they're covering and discussing. So, with that said, next week I plan on not so much bad news, but actually I want to talk about some things occurring and some articles we'll look through and signs of the time as to why uranium is looking good. It'll actually be a more article-heavy piece than it will be a chart-heavy piece. Thank you for listening, and until next week.